Continuing on with Chapter 36, we're looking at the start of the Cold War from 1945 to 1952. Now, looking specifically at the Cold War, we've already touched on some of the major changes going on in the United States. Looking at the start of the Cold War, or this division between the United States and the Soviet Union, its roots really have a hold in society at the end of World War II, specifically at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. The big three, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, met at Yalta. This is still before the war is actually over yet, but they were coming together to discuss what the world was going to look like after World War II was over. And at Yalta, they decided several things that are going to have long-lasting consequences, even into today. First and foremost, they decided that once Germany was conquered, they would be divided into 4 zones of occupation, just for the time being. Later, they would reunite them after a period of time. Each zone would be occupied by one of the 4 conquering powers, the U.S., Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Stalin also agreed to free elections in Poland and other Eastern European countries. Specifically, this is important because as the Soviet army marched across the face of Europe, pushing the Germans back into Germany, they were literally occupying Eastern Europe. So unless Stalin agreed to free elections and to allow democracy in these countries, it wasn't going to happen. This is something he promised. He later went back on his word with this. They also agreed to create the United Nations as an international peacekeeping organization, since the League of Nations had already failed. And the Soviet Union agreed to enter the war in Japan once victory was declared in Europe. So these are all major things that are going to affect us later on as well. Here you see the big 3, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin at the Yalta Conference. And here you see the start of the United Nations. Now, I've been referencing this Cold War, and there's a lot of things that happened to create this Cold War. It's called a Cold War because we never actually directly had a war with the Soviet Union. It remained cold, just this period of time that's very stressful and tension-filled between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. There are some examples of when the Cold War, quote-unquote, got hot, meaning we were facing other countries as a result of our fear of communism. So a couple of reasons why this Cold War started to begin with. This had been brewing for a long time anyway. The fact that we had been allies during World War II was only out of necessity, only because we shared a common enemy. Long before the Cold War, before World War II had started, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were not friends. In fact, we hadn't even recognized the Soviet Union as a legitimate government until 1933. The U.S. had given money to the White Army during their own Civil War, which was not too, or it wasn't looked on appropriately by the Red Army. There is also a major ideological difference, a communistic dictatorship versus democracy here in the United States. And the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union are the only 2 remaining superpowers after World War II is over, because Great Britain, they, put up a good fight for a lot of years, but they got their own business to take care of after World War II is over, is only going to exacerbate some of these issues. That we are competing with them over who is going to be the #1 superpower in the world. Stalin is still pretty angry at the United States for delaying that second front. Remember, 10 million Russians died during World War II, and Stalin believes part of that is because we had delayed opening that front in France. We had deliberately kept them from knowing any of our atomic bomb secrets until the bomb was detonated, and they felt that that was sneaky on the United States' part. Also, the end of World War II brought an end to Lend-Lease. They had asked us for a $6 billion loan, which we refused, but yet at the same time, the United States is going to start rebuilding Europe, which the Soviet Union was not too keen on as well. But one of the biggest things that is going to divide the United States and the Soviet Union is over the fate of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union, looking at the past wars that they have fought, say there is no dividing line between us and the rest of Europe. That every war that has come from an invading force from Europe, and there's nothing to stop them. There's not a mountain range, a river, an ocean, nothing to stop an invading force from coming in and killing millions of Russian people. And so even though Stalin had agreed to those free elections in Poland and Eastern Europe at the Yalta Conference, he didn't really actually think that that was going to happen. They wanted a buffer zone, meaning they wanted friendly governments in Eastern Europe to serve as a buffer or a cushion, so that should another war come, it was going to be much more difficult to march through a loyal Poland than it would be a Poland that could care less what happens to the Soviet Union. So that promise for free elections is not going to happen, and in fact they are going to add them to their sphere of influence, meaning these countries are going to be required to be communist satellite nations, which we'll talk more about later on. So the Cold War is really an ideological difference. There is no direct conflict, but it's a miracle there was never a direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, because there was such a military arms buildup during this time. So for the next 40 plus years, there is going to be an us versus them mentality, suspicions over communist spies or American spies over there, and who is going to come out on top, who is going to be the number one superpower. And this doesn't actually end until 1991, when the Soviet Union fell. Other things that the United States was angry about. Looking back at the start of World War II, they said the only reason you joined this war was because Hitler had invaded you. Prior to that, you had had that non-aggression pact with Hitler. You invaded Poland when the Germans had invaded as well. This was looked on poorly by the United States. The U.S. was looking for democracy, demilitarization, and the end of colonization, and a focus on the United States or on the United Nations. This is not what the Soviet Union was looking for. They were looking to protect their own, and who can really blame them at that point as well? And like I said before, that increasing fear of atomic weaponry is going to ratchet up the Cold War conflict. So the U.S. acquires an atomic bomb in 1945. The Soviet Union acquires a bomb by 1945. The Soviet Union acquires it by 1949. And from there, we are just going to keep building larger and larger and larger atomic weapons. So a couple of other things happening after World War II were over. Economically speaking, the United States is going to focus more on not making the same mistakes that it had done after World War I, namely ignoring internationalism. So in July of 44, we held the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire to establish an international money system. 44 Western allies met. Two things were created here: the World Bank, which still is in existence today. Their goal is to provide economic assistance and loans to developing countries and to end poverty in those areas. Also, we created the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, to establish international exchange rates based on gold and to promote trade between nations, because once again, countries who trade with one another are less likely to go to war with one another. But the biggest thing that the United States does that's different after World War II compared to World War I is we play a major role in the United Nations. The United Nations Conference was held in April of 1945 in San Francisco to create this charter, which still obviously exists today. The makeup of the United Nations, very, very briefly, there are several different agencies. The Security Council has 5 permanent members. These are the 5 conquering powers of World War II. The United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, France, and China. They are permanent members. And then there are also 10 rotating members on an every 2 or 3 year basis. The thing that's important about the Security Council is they have veto power. So any sort of bill or proposed idea that comes before the Security Council, any one of those members on the Security Council has the right to say no, and that's the end of it. There is also the General Assembly, where all member nations are involved. That's almost like their legislative branch. There's the Secretariat, also known as the Secretary General. They're kind of like the administrator. They coordinate the agencies, make sure there's this proper and smooth running. They're also the leader of the United Nations as well. There's also the UN Trusteeship Council. This is similar to those mandates after World War I. This its job is to administer to the former colonies, to help them become self-governing, to get them on their feet as well. And then last but not least, the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, whose job is to hear cases of international law. Um, and so even though the United Nations is set up, the problem with it is that a lot of the Cold War tensions are going to play out in this Security Council, because each of the U.S. and the Soviet Union each have the ability to veto the other's proposed legislation. Which is going to be a problem later on. The United Nations is set up permanently in New York City to ensure the United States continues to participate. Okay. Other things occurring after World War II, the creation of the Nuremberg trials. This is really the first time in world history where international law is used to try and convict high members within the Nazi government. They said there are some things that occur during war that are so horrible that no one court in a singular country can try them, that these are crimes against humanity that have been committed, or crimes against peace. Overall, these are war crimes that have been tried. And so for the first time, international law is put to the test against high members of the Nazi government, specifically for things that had been conducted during the war. Obviously, the Holocaust was a leading reason for a war crimes tribunal. 20 were sentenced to death, others to varying levels of prison time up to life. And their defense, and this is something that we hear over and over and over again, even into today, was we were just following orders. What were we supposed to do? Say no to our commanding officers? But the message that comes out of the Nuremberg trials are, there are some things that are so heinous, so horrible, that if you are given that order, you have to say no, that you have to think about the effect that this is going to have on humanity. Subsequent trials would later convict about 200 more war criminals during this period of time. So issues going on with the Soviet Union. Now, like I said, the Soviet Union had once agreed to free elections in Poland. That's not going to happen. But more than that, they were demanding that half section of Poland that they had been promised during that non-aggression pact. They say that this is going to account for their war reparations, that they're not giving this back, that this has to become part of the Soviet Union. So in order to make it fair to Poland, because it's not really fair that they get cut in half, the entire boundary line shifted over to take portions of Germany away and give it to Poland. So the entire borderline of Poland shifted to the west in order to allow the Soviet Union to have this land. But still, they're not going to allow free elections in this area. They're not going to give up this zone. They want this buffer zone. And so Eastern Europe becomes what are known as satellite nations. If you think of the Earth, things circulating around it, or the satellites circulating around it, are the smaller objects. If you think of the Soviet Union as the big body in space, all of these Eastern European countries are the satellites circling around it. So even though they are, in theory, independent countries, the strings are being pulled by the USSR. One of the countries that is also added to the satellite nations is Eastern Germany. So even though Germany had been divided at the end of the war, they were refusing to give up their zone of occupation. Their goal was to keep Germany weak. So instead, we see the creation of two different countries. East Germany, which is going to be occupied by the Soviet Union and added to those satellite nations, and West Germany. The U.S., France, and Great Britain reunified their zones to make a Western Germany. The problem comes in that the capital city of Berlin is right smack dab in the middle of the Soviet zone. They decided that that was too important of a city to just allow the Soviets to have, and so Berlin was also divided as well. And so here is West Berlin. It is technically part of West Germany. It is a democracy, but it is surrounded by communism all around it. That is going to be important several times over the coming years of the Cold War. Here you see some of the leading members on trial for war crimes at Nuremberg. So like I said, West Germany versus East Germany is going to be a big sticking point between the Western Allies versus the Soviet Union. But Stalin was quick to say, I'm not allowing the reunification. I want to keep them as weak as possible. And so at this point, we are starting to realize what is being created here. And in 1946, Winston Churchill, traveling across the United States, gave a very, very important speech in which he said, an iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe. And this becomes an analogy for the rest of the Cold War, that behind that, quote, iron curtain is communism, are those satellite nations. And then on the other side is going to be the democracy of Western Europe. It is a dividing line between us versus them, which is obviously very appropriate for Cold War mentality. But back to Berlin for a second. The Soviet Union, they were very unhappy that the France, Great Britain, and the United States had reunified our sections to make West Germany. And so as a way to punish us, and also because they wanted all of Berlin anyway, they said, well, that's fine. West Berlin can stay a democracy. It could stay part of West Germany, but you can't use the roads through Eastern Germany to get supplies into the West Berliners. They instituted a blockade against all traffic and all supplies going into West Berlin. The hope was that the United States, France, and Great Britain would allow the Soviet Union just to have West Berlin. However, the United States is going to be very reluctant just to give up on West Berlin because they see the writing on the wall. They're not going to allow the Soviet Union, even early on at this time, have its way. And so the United States and Great Britain responded with what's known as the Berlin Airlift. Well, they couldn't use their roads, so they were going to fly planes over West Berlin every couple of hours and drop in food and supplies, obviously via parachutes, for almost over a year, until finally the Soviet Union agreed to lift the blockade, and West Berlin remained a democracy surrounded by the rest of Eastern Europe. This really plays into this idea as created by George Kennan, who was an American diplomat at this time, promoting a policy of containment. This is really, really important. We are starting to say, or starting to look at communism almost like a disease. And like any disease, you want to contain it, you want to quarantine it. So our goal, as outlined by George Kennan for the duration of the Cold War, is to contain the spread of communism. Where it exists now, we can't stop it. We're not going to try to get rid of it in the Soviet Union, but we're not going to allow it to spread beyond those borders to contain communism. This policy of containment is really going to dictate how all the presidents after this respond to the Cold War. In 1947, Truman, using the policy of containment, issued his Truman Doctrine to give $400 million to Greece and Turkey because our fear was that they were so economically depressed that they were susceptible to turning to communism if the Soviet Union would give them money. So we are basically saying we will help free people anywhere so that they do not turn to communism. So it starts specifically with Greece and Turkey, but it's going to expand elsewhere. Our goal is to keep it from spreading. This is included in 1947 when the U.S. government creates the Marshall Plan, headed up by Secretary of State George Marshall. The idea here is to rebuild war-torn Europe. War-torn areas are more susceptible to turning to communism if that country is willing to give them money. So Kennan said, let us rebuild Europe, and this will stop the spread of communism and also will create some really good trading partners with the rest of Europe. And so to the tune of $12.5 billion, the United States rebuilt Europe. We built their train stations. We rebuilt their major buildings. We rebuilt their major cities, all to contain the spread of communism and also to create trading partners with the rest of Europe. And last but not least for this slide, for the first time ever in American history, the United States entered into a peacetime alliance, which we are still members of today in 1948, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, in which we said an attack on one would be an attack on all. The Soviet Union responded by forming their own peacetime alliance known as the Warsaw Pact between them and their Eastern European satellite nations. And so basically, the line is being drawn in the sand here. On the one side are the NATO countries. On the other side are the Warsaw Pact countries. And if one country from each side goes to war, we all go to war. And so all those years ago when Washington had argued against peacetime alliances, we are now finally breaking that mentality because our fear of communism is so strong. Here you see that partitioning of Germany, those 4 zones of occupation, the changing of borders, and then also the dividing of Berlin as well. Here you see some of the West Berliners waiting for the airlift in 1948. And once again, the dividing line between the satellite nations and the rest of Europe, or that Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it. And then all of the aid that is going to flow to all over the world as a result of our desire to contain communism. Here is a political cartoon depicting Uncle Sam walking shakily across this bridge of our new American foreign policy, giving aid to Greece and Turkey. But notice he's blindfolded, so this would be a cartoon against this Truman Doctrine. And then in the other picture, you see part of Germany, because that's the German side in the back, being rebuilt with money from the Marshall Plan.